Sahih Bukhari, a Hadith reading by Nolan Alford. Book 4, Part 2, Ablution, Chapter 186, narrated by Amr. My father saw Amr bin Abi Hassan asking Abdullah bin Zayd about the ablution of the Prophet. Abdullah bin Zayd asked for an earthenware pot containing water, and in front of them performed ablution like that of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He poured water from the pot over his hand and washed his hands thrice. And then he put his hands in the pot and rinsed his mouth and washed his nose by putting water in it and then by blowing it out with 3 handfuls of water. Again, he put his hand in the water and washed his face thrice and washed his forearms up to the elbows twice, and then he put his hands in the water and then passed them over his head by bringing them to the front and then to the rear of the head once, and then he washed his feet up to the ankles. Chapter 187, narrated by Abu Juhayfa. Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, came to us at noon, and water for ablution was brought to him. After he had performed ablution, the remaining water was taken by the people, and they started smearing their bodies with it as a blessed thing. The Prophet, peace be upon him, offered 2 rakat of the Zuhr prayer and then 2 rakat of the Asr prayer, while a short spear or stick was there in front of him. Chapter 188, narrated by Abu Musa. The Prophet asked for a tumbler containing water, and washed both his hands and face in it, and then threw a mouthful of water in the tumbler, and said to both of us, Abu Musa and Bilal, "Drink from the tumbler, and pour some of its water on your faces and chests." Chapter 189, narrated by Ibn Shihab. Mahmud bin Arabi, who was the person on whose face the Prophet, peace be upon him, had ejected a mouthful of water from his family's well while he was a boy, and Urwa, on the authority of Al-Miswar and others, who testified each other, said, whenever the Prophet, peace be upon him, performed ablution, his companions were nearly fighting for the remains of the water. Chapter 190, narrated by Az-Saib bin Yazid. My aunt took me to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and said, O Allah's Messenger, this son of my sister has got a disease in his legs. So he passed his hands on my head and prayed for Allah's blessings for me. Then he performed ablution, and I drank from the remaining water. I stood behind him and saw the seal of prophethood between his shoulders, and it was like the Zir al-Hilja. Author's note, Zir al-Hilja means the button of a small tent, but some have also said the egg of a partridge as well. Essentially just a small dot, if that makes sense. Chapter 191, narrated by Amir bin Yahya. On the authority of his father, Abdullah bin Zayd poured water on his hands from a utensil containing water, and washed them, and then with 1 handful of water, he rinsed his mouth and cleaned his nose by putting water in it and blowing it out. He repeated it thrice. He then washed his hands and forearms up to the elbows twice, and passed wet hands over his head, both forwards and backwards, and washed his feet up to the ankles, and said, This is the ablution of Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him. Chapter 192, narrated by Amr bin Yahya. My father said, I saw Amr bin Abi Hassan asking Abdullah bin Zayd about the ablution of the Prophet. Abdullah bin Zayd asked for an earthenware pot containing water and performed ablution in front of them. He poured water over his hands and washed them thrice. Then he put his right hand in the pot and rinsed his mouth and washed his nose by putting water in it and then blowing it out thrice with 3 handfuls of water. Again, he put his hand in the water and washed his face thrice. After that, he put his hand in the pot and washed his forearms up to the elbows thrice, and then again put his hand in the water and passed wet hands over his head by bringing them to the front and then to the back. And once more, he put his hand in the pot and washed his feet up to the ankles. Narrated Wuhaib that he, the Prophet, peace be upon him, in narration above, had passed the wet hands on the head once only. Chapter 193, narrated by Abdullah bin Umar. During the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, men and women used to perform ablution together. Chapter 194, narrated by Jabir. Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, came to visit me while I was sick and unconscious. He performed ablution and sprinkled the remaining water on me, and I became conscious and said, O Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, to whom will my inheritance go, as I have neither ascendants nor descendants? Then the divine verses regarding Fara'id, inheritance, were revealed. Chapter 195, narrated Anas. It was the time for prayer, and those whose houses were near got up and went to their people to perform ablution. And there remained some people sitting. And then a painted stove-pot, a miktab, containing water, was brought to Allah's Messenger. The pot was small, not broad enough for one to spread one's hand in, yet all the people performed ablution. The sub-narrator said, We asked Anas, How many persons were you? Anas replied, There were 80 or more. This was one of the miracles of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Chapter 196, narrated Abu Musa. Once the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked for a tumbler containing water. He washed his hands and face in it, and also threw a mouthful of water in it. Chapter 197, narrated Abdullah bin Zayd. Once Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, came to us, and we brought out water for him in a brass pot. He performed ablution thus. He washed his face thrice, and his forearms to the elbow twice, then passed his wet hands lightly over the head from front to rear, and brought them to the front again, and washed his feet up to the ankles. Chapter 198, narrated by Aisha. When the ailment of the Prophet, peace be upon him, became aggravated, and his disease became severe, he asked his wives to permit him to be nursed in my house. So they gave him the permission. Then the Prophet came to my house with the support of 2 men, and his legs were dragging on the ground, between Abbas and another man. Ubaidullah, the sub-narrator, said, I informed Abdullah bin Abbas of what Aisha said. Ibn Abbas said, Do you know who was the other man? I replied in the negative. Ibn Abbas said, He was Ali. Aisha further said, When the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to my house, and his sickness became aggravated, he ordered us to pour 7 skins full of water on him, so that he might give some advice to the people. So he was seated in a miktab belonging to Hafsa, the wife of the Prophet. Then all of us started pouring water on him from the water skins till he beckoned us to stop, and that we have done what he wanted us to do. After that he went out to the people. Chapter 199, narrated Amr bin Yahya. On the authority of his father, my uncle used to perform ablution extravagantly, and once he asked Abdullah bin Zayd to tell him how he had seen the Prophet, peace be upon him, perform. He asked for an earthenware pot containing water, and poured water from it on his hands and washed them thrice, and then put his hand in the earthenware pot and rinsed his mouth and washed his nose by putting water in it, and then blowing it out thrice with 1 handful of water. He again put his hand in the water and took a handful of water and washed his face thrice, then washed his hands up to the elbow twice, and took water with his hand, passed it over his head from front to back, and then from back to front, and then washed his feet up to the ankles and said, I saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, performing ablution in that way. Chapter 200, narrated by Thabit. Anas said, The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked for water and a tumbler with a broad base containing a small quantity of water. The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked for water, and a tumbler with a broad base containing a small quantity of water was brought to him, whereby he put his fingers in it. Anas further said, I noticed the water springing out from amongst his fingers. Anas added, I estimated that the people who performed ablution with it numbered between 70 to 80. Chapter 201, narrated by Anas. The Prophet, peace be upon him, used to take a bath with 1 sa, up to 5 muds, of water, and used to perform ablution with 1 mud of water. Chapter 202, narrated by Abdullah bin Umar. Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas said, The Prophet, peace be upon him, passed wet hands over his socks made from thick fabric. Abdullah bin Umar asked Umar about it. Omar replied in the affirmative and added, "Whenever Sa'ad narrates a hadith from the Prophet, there is no need to ask anyone else about it." Chapter 203, narrated by Al-Bukhari bin Shuba. Once Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, went out to answer the call of nature, and I followed him with a tumbler containing water. And when he finished, I poured water, and he performed ablution and passed wet hands over his socks made from thick leather. Chapter 204, narrated by Jafar bin Amr bin Umayyah ad-Damri. My father said, I saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, passing wet hands over his socks made from thick fabric or leather. Chapter 205, narrated by Jafar bin Amr. My father said, I saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, passing wet hands over his turban and socks made from thick fabric or leather. Chapter 206, narrated Urwa bin al-Mughira. My father said, once I was in the company of the Prophet, peace be upon him, on a journey, and I dashed to take off his socks made from thick fabric. He ordered me to leave them, as he had put them on after performing ablution, so he passed wet hands over them. Chapter 207, narrated by Abdullah bin Abbas. Allah's Messenger ate a piece of cooked mutton from the shoulder region and prayed without repeating ablution. Chapter 208, narrated Jafar bin Amr bin Umayyah. My father said, I saw Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, taking a piece of cooked mutton from the shoulder region, and then he was called for prayer. He put his knife down and prayed without repeating ablution. Chapter 209, narrated Suwaid bin al-Numan. In the year of the conquest of Khaybar, I went with Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, till we reached Sabah, a place near Khaybar, where Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, offered the Asr prayer and asked for food. Nothing but sawiq was brought. We ordered it to be moistened with water. He and all of us ate it, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, got up for the evening prayer, rinsed his mouth with water, and we did the same. He then prayed without repeating the ablution. Chapter 210, narrated by Maimuna. The Prophet, peace be upon him, ate a piece of mutton from the shoulder region and then prayed without repeating the ablution. Chapter 211, narrated Ibn Abbas. Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, drank milk and rinsed his mouth and said, It has fat. Chapter 212, narrated by Aisha. Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, said, If any one of you feels drowsy while praying, he should go to bed till his slumber is over, because praying while drowsy, one does not know whether they are asking for forgiveness or for a bad thing for oneself. Chapter 213, narrated Anas. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, If any of you feels drowsy while praying, he should sleep till he understands what he is reciting. Chapter 214, narrated Amr bin Amir. Anas said, The Prophet, peace be upon him, used to perform ablution for every prayer. I asked Anas, What did you used to do? Anas replied, We used to pray with the same ablution until we break it with hadath. Chapter 215, narrated Suwaid bin Numan. In the year of the conquest of Khaybar, I went with Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, till we reached Az-Saba, where Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, led the Asr prayer and asked for food. Nothing but sawiq was brought, and we ate it and drank water. The Prophet, peace be upon him, got up for the Maghrib prayer, rinsed his mouth with water, and then led the prayer without repeating the ablution. Chapter 216, narrated by Ibn Abbas. Once the Prophet, while passing through one of the graveyards of Medina or Mecca, heard the voices of two persons who were being tortured in their graves. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, These two persons are being tortured not from a major sin to avoid. The Prophet, peace be upon him, then added, Yes, they are being tortured for a major sin. Indeed, one of them never saved himself from being soiled with his urine, while the other used to go about with calumnies. The Prophet, peace be upon him, then asked for a green leaf of a date palm tree, broke it into 2 pieces, and put one on each grave. On being asked why he had done so, he replied, I hope that the torture might be lessened till these get dried. Chapter 217, narrated Anas bin Malik. Whenever the Prophet, peace be upon him, went to answer the call of nature, I used to bring water with which he used to clean his private parts. Chapter 218, narrated Ibn Abbas. The Prophet, peace be upon him, once passed by two graves and said, "These two persons are being tortured not for a major sin. One of them never saved himself from being soiled from his urine, and the other used to go about with calumnies." The Prophet, peace be upon him, then took a green leaf of a date palm tree, split it into pieces, and fixed one on each grave. They said, "O Allah's Apostle, why have you done so?" He replied, "I hope that their punishment might be lessened till the pieces of the leaf become dry." Chapter 219, narrated by Anas bin Malik. The Prophet, peace be upon him, saw a Bedouin making water in the mosque and told the people not to disturb him. When he finished, the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked for some water and poured it over the urine. Chapter 220, narrated Abu Hurairah. A Bedouin stood up and started making water in the mosque. The people caught him, but the Prophet, peace be upon him, ordered them to leave him and to pour a bucket or a tumbler of water over the place where he passed the urine. The Prophet, peace be upon him, then said, "You have been sent to make things easy and not to make them difficult." Chapter 221 is a repeat of Chapter 219. Chapter 222, narrated by Aisha. A child was brought to Allah's Messenger, and it urinated on the garment of the Prophet. The Prophet asked for water and poured it over the soiled place. Chapter 223, narrated by Qais bint Misin. I brought my young son, who had not started eating ordinary food, to Allah's Messenger, who took him and made him sit in his lap. The child urinated on the garment of the Prophet, so he asked for water and poured it over the soiled areas and did not wash it.